Ding, 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 ding. You believe First stop, Armageddon, sweetie.
In the 1960s, Lenny Bruce was decades ahead of his time. A hip comic genius who spouted social criticism to waken America.
Lenny was saying things and challenging his audiences in the way that no other comedian, humorist had ever done before. He was crossing the line.
But Lenny was also a hardcore dope addict.
They had to have a fit.
Who plunged into madness and died with a needle in his arm.
He had problems with drugs, and of course he had tremendous problems with the law.
In the next hour, we will trace the rise of America's pioneer of hip, racy stand-up comedy, from his start as a strip show gag man.
His humor was raw, raw humor. He used a lot of, as the police thought, bad words.
We will hear Lenny's friends describe the comic's battles with dope.
He was using heroin, he was using methamphetamine.
We will follow Lenny's transformation from underground comedian to champion of free speech.
It was frank, adult, and intelligent discussions of race, sex, and politics.
We will hear from the cops who knew Lenny as they reveal for the first time details of the comic's secret life as a drug informant.
He didn't have any loyalty to any of those people. He felt they were ripping him off and they were lowlifes.
We will examine Lenny's gruesome death and the rumors it may have been murder.
If it was, it'll be a perfect one because nobody will ever know.
And in an exclusive interview, we will hear Lenny's only child describe her father's lifelong torment.
We were both estranged. We were both abused. We were both loved.
This is the story of a renegade funny man. This is the story of Lenny Bruce, the true Hollywood story.
Lenny was cool, but yet hot.
From life's ambition was to be the star. The 1960s was a decade of revolt against racial prejudice and sexual taboos. To West Coast nightclub impresario Gene Norman, the 60s was the decade of Lenny Bruce.
He would attack anything and everybody. And that was the beginning of what we saw as the great protest of the 60s, in my opinion. He was the first one. He was the Pied Piper.
Lenny Bruce, the Pied Piper of protest, was born Leonard Alfred Schneider in the rural suburbs of Long Island, New York, October 13, 1925. Lenny was an only child whose parents were a mismatch. His father, Myron, was a shoe clerk, but Lenny's mother, Sadie, was a dancer and aspiring actress whose stage name was Sally Marr, comedian and family friend Jackie Gale.
I swear, if you didn't know them, you'd think Sally was Lenny's big sister. If you didn't think it was his mother, you'd think they were, like, because they hung out together. He loved his mother.
Sally Marr had dreams of Broadway glory. When Lenny was 8 years old, Sally divorced her husband and took her son to New York.
Sally took him and she had a dancing school when she was little. She worked as a housekeeper, too, and when Lenny was with her for some rich people.
Being a single mother cramped Sally's show business plans, and she soon sent Lenny back to his father. Sally's rejection permanently damaged her son, Lenny's daughter, Kitty.
Sally put all of his stuff inside a bag and said, "I can't take it anymore." My father comes schlepping down the road like a hobo because Grandma Sally, quote, doesn't want him anymore, out.
From the age of 9, Lenny was raised by his father. Over the years, their relationship became increasingly hostile. Lenny spent hours in front of his radio, lost in dreams.
My father always lived for Andy Hardy, Norman Rockwell, all the neat stuff, you know, family, praying before dinner. Never happened. One day he got real PO'd and he took a rifle and shot a turkey off a table through the neighbor's house because he was angry about Thanksgiving because he couldn't have it.
Playwright and biographer Frank Spicer.
He wound up running away from home when he was 16 and wound up living with this couple out in a farm in Long Island called by the name of the Danglers, and to live with them for a couple of years doing odd jobs on the farm and basically being bored to death, which eventually drove him to join the Navy.
Lenny witnessed fierce combat during World War II. Between battles, he devised shipboard comedy routines to entertain fellow sailors. After 3 years at sea, Lenny yearned for civilian life. In 1945, he used one of his comedy routines to escape the Navy. He started dressing as a female sailor, then called a wave.
He bribed one of his fellow sailors who had some ability to be a great sewing artist into creating a wave costume for him, and while everybody was asleep, he would walk the decks of the ship in this wave costume until he finally got busted.
Lenny was dishonorably discharged by the Navy and vowed to develop his comedic skills. He enrolled in a Hollywood acting school, but dropped out after a few months. In 1947, 21-year-old Lenny landed back in New York, hoping to regain his mother's favor.
He started taking odd jobs, but then this opportunity came for him to actually jump on stage and be an MC one night at a club that his mother was working in, and that was the beginning of his comedy career.
Working together in burlesque, Lenny and Sally resumed their old relationship. At Sally's suggestion, Lenny adopted his own stage name in 1947. Leonard Schneider became Lenny Bruce.
Just about that time, he won an Arthur Godfrey talent show, and they went into the Strand Theater. And I'll never forget how he came out. He had a white dinner jacket, tuxedo pants, handsome. He was a good-looking guy, and he did that show business skip out.
From 1948 to 1951, Lenny Bruce built his comedy act playing in East Coast strip clubs. In the beginning, Lenny's routines were ordinary.
Lots of impressions, lots of mother-in-law jokes, banana peel jokes, making fun of other people. He was your very typical comic that was working the comedy circuit in those days.
But in 1951, while working a Baltimore burlesque club, 26-year-old Lenny met a red-haired stripper who turned him inside out. 24-year-old Harriet Lloyd billed herself as Hot Honey Harlow.
Oh, she was beautiful. She looked like you'd Rita Hayworth, any of them, the long, flowing red hair. The first time I saw her with Lenny, I said, wow.
Honey was more than beautiful. She was a convicted felon, twice divorced, bisexual, and in love with another woman. Honey set Lenny on fire.
As Lenny was always said, she was a cross between a hooker and the Madonna.
When the E! True Hollywood story continues, Lenny Bruce makes strippers blush.
He would say the F word, for instance. Is that the way we say it nowadays?
And later, Lenny, Honey, Sally, and heroin.
If Sally would have known what was going to happen later on, she would have taken a gun and shot Honey.
In the late 1940s, Lenny Bruce was a bright young comic trying to build a future in burlesque. By the 1950s, Lenny's memories of a lonely childhood began to transform his comedy style.
He wanted to be the center of attention because he never got any attention.
After 4 years of working East Coast burlesque shows, 26-year-old Lenny Bruce became disillusioned. He sensed his career was going nowhere. In 1951, Lenny gave up comedy and signed on with the Merchant Marines. But a week before shipping out, Lenny met Harriet Lloyd, a 24-year-old stripper known as Hot Honey Harlow. Playwright biographer Frank Spicer.
He just became so totally flipped out from Honey that that's all he could think about when he was at sea. The first port of call that they got into, he called her and told her that he was mad about her and loved her, and he was coming back home to see her.
Weeks after sailing, Lenny quit the Merchant Marines. He joined Honey in Miami, and the couple began a heated romance. Lenny was also arrested for the first time in Miami for dressing as a priest and pocketing donations. In June of '51, 26-year-old Lenny and 24-year-old Honey returned to Honey's hometown, Detroit, and the two were married in City Hall. In 1952, Lenny and Honey Bruce packed up and headed to California for a fresh start. Lenny wanted to make movies.
There were twofold reasons for Lenny moving out to Los Angeles, but the main reason was the film industry. That was the mecca, that was the capital, and it still is. Also, of course, there was a big nightclub scene going out there as well.
In Los Angeles, Lenny's movie dreams sputtered. 20th Century Fox gave him a tryout as a scriptwriter, but Lenny's work was rejected. By 1953, Lenny and Honey were back on stage working LA burlesque clubs, including a spot called Strip City. One of the stars was Stacey Farrell, billed as Eartha Quake.
Lenny would come out at the beginning of the show, and he would do a little monologue, and he would make the band laugh and get them all relaxed so they'd play good for the strippers.
At Strip City, Lenny's comedy style began to change. Comedian Frankie Ray.
When you're in a joint for a year, and you keep going and you look how all the same degenerates are sitting there waiting for the broads, you better come up with something.
What Lenny came up with was language rarely spoken in public. He used street slang to introduce strippers like Betty Rowland, billed as the Ball of Fire.
Well, he would say like, oh, the F word, for instance. Is that the way we say it nowadays? And words of that sort. And call ladies bad names and call guys and so forth like that.
Lenny's edgy humor won him a new set of fans, the musicians in the house band.
All musicians loved him. Musicians sometimes, when he would come on or when the MC comes on, they would leave the bandstand. But it'd be a rare occasion that the bands would leave the bandstand when he was on.
Lenny's musician pals introduced Lenny to a new way of life, a life steeped in drugs.
He started to delve into the drug scene that was very prevalent among jazz musicians, and eventually started doing liquid amphetamines, which became a big drug of choice of his.
Lenny's daughter, Kitty.
In order to get amphetamines, told the doctor, "Yoy, I have narcolepsy, I fall asleep, so therefore I need ampules of syringe amphetamines."
In 1954, Lenny returned to movie making. He began producing his own films on a shoestring budget. Lenny's first movie, Dream Follies, was a sex farce starring stripper Stacey Farrell.
His humor was raw, raw humor. His philosophy was that what was bad for people in general was killing people, stabbing people, doing harm to people, not making love.
Lenny's next movie, Dance Hall Racket, starred Lenny and Honey.
I don't want to wind up like that, Lenny.
Look, I'm not going to say nothing now. I got a lot of big plans. What? I'm thinking all the time. And if everything works all right, baby, you'll listen.
And many of Lenny's jazz buddies. Comedian Shecky Green.
I think if he would have ever straightened out, which he would have been a very big screenwriter, I don't think he would have continued on as a comic.
But Lenny's movies went nowhere, and he did continue as a comic. By the mid-1950s, Lenny's risque routines were gaining notoriety. Police started visiting Strip City.
He would have meetings with the owners, and they would talk to him, and he would promise them that he would not do that anymore. But then, when the show went on, Lenny did the same thing, and maybe even worse.
When the E! True Hollywood story continues, Lenny and Honey party too hard.
Lenny says, now, why don't you Honey? And I said, well, if I have to.
And later, Lenny's fall.
I saw Lenny go from a giant, functioning fairly well, into a helpless mess.
Lenny Bruce was an LA strip joint comic with uptown Hollywood dreams.
You're lucky I'm interviewing you. Let me see your legs.
But in the 1950s, Lenny changed. He began shooting speed and lacing his comedy with four-letter words.
He didn't care what you thought or whether you liked it or not, he would do it. And he would never stop.
In 1955, 30-year-old Lenny Bruce began the most creative period of his life. Lenny and his wife, Honey, had their only child, born Brandy Kathleen Kitty Bruce. Lenny adored her.
He babied me. He had a chart that said, okay, Kitty will be fed at 2 o'clock. This is what she's going to eat. I slept in a dresser drawer. When he was on stage, when my mother and father would gig.
Lenny left his job as MC at Strip City in 1955 and began trying stand-up comedy. He started working rooms at the bottom of the show business ladder. Playwright biographer Frank Spicer.
As he described them, they were basically toilets and strip joints, some jazz rooms, but Lenny had no qualms about working what he called toilets.
In 1956, Lenny even brought his wife Honey Harlow into his show at an LA joint called Duffy's Gaiety.
They tried to do an act together where he tried to develop her as a singer. And she started doing all right, but it never really took off.
Lenny and Honey also became deeply involved in the after-hours jazz scene of the mid-1950s. The couple's circle of friends included trumpeter Jack Sheldon.
Always at the party, somebody would OD. I remember one time Honey OD'd and we just put her in the bathtub and turned cold water on her.
Working at Duffy's, Lenny and Honey graduated from injecting speed to injecting heroin while raising a child.
I've never saw my father shoot drugs in my life. Ever. Ever, 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 ever. He spent a lot of time in the library. He spent a lot of time in the bathroom. Daddy, 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 come out, come out, come out. Mommy, 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 come out, come out, come out.
Comedian Jackie Gale.
He was getting high. He'd stop periodically, but he'd go back to it. Yeah, he was addicted to drugs.
At Duffy's Gaiety Club, Lenny used his drug experiences to create his sharpest satire about politics, race, and the ills of 1950s society.
Lenny would get high with these wonderful hip musicians, and at the same time, these cats had to go to a different bathroom in Alabama to take a pee. Why was this going on?
At home, Lenny and Honey dabbled in riskier business, sex orgies.
One night we were in the house at on Las Palmas, and everybody had left, and it was just me and Honey and Lenny left. And Lenny says, "Now, why don't you fuck Honey?" And I said, "Well, if I have to." But, you know, it was his idea, and so we went in bed and we're making love, and he kept crawling in the room, and she'd say, "Lenny, get out of the room."
In 1956, the 5-year marriage of Lenny and Honey fell apart. The couple flew to Honolulu to try a reconciliation, but within a month, Honey was arrested in Honolulu for marijuana possession. As a convicted felon, she was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Their divorce became final in 1958, and Lenny won custody of daughter Kitty, comic Shecky Green.
Kitty, I think, was 6 months old, maybe a year. Then he came to me and he says to me after the trial, I didn't go down to court with him, will I please adopt Kitty? And knowing his background and Honey's background, I said no.
Instead, Kitty went to live with her grandmother, Sally Marr. In late 1957, Lenny's career picked up steam. He moved his act to a swank new Hollywood club, the Crescendo, owner Gene Norman.
Gradually, he started to improvise, and he became more socially oriented. He started to do social commentary, and you could see the genesis of what he became famous for.
In 1958, Lenny debuted in San Francisco. It was here that Lenny achieved national acclaim with his daring social satire. Playboy publisher Hugh Hefner.
We saw him one night there and were blown away by him. And we did a major profile on him in that time frame, and that was the beginning, really, of his national fame.
When the E! True Hollywood story returns, Lenny's first dope bust.
He had scar tissue, scabs, puncture wounds, fresh puncture wounds.
And later, Honey's return.
He's got Honey in the bed. I guess she was nude too. Maybe they had 6 other people, you know.